They hid me in a church. During the bombings, the boy who brought me food became my husband in 1964. The first time Elena Rossi saw the boy with the gentle eyes, she was crouched behind the altar of San Michele, her knees pressed against cold marble, listening to the drone of enemy planes overhead. It was October 1943, and Rome had become a city of shadows and whispered prayers. The ancient church, with its cracked frescoes and bullet-scarred walls, had become her sanctuary, a place where a 19-year-old Jewish girl could disappear into the darkness between the stone columns and hope the war would forget her name. Father Giuseppe had found her 3 weeks earlier, wandering the bombed-out streets near the old Jewish quarter, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her grandmother's silver locket clutched in her trembling fingers. The Nazis had come in the night, as they always did, and Elena had watched from a neighbor's window as her parents and younger brother were loaded into trucks bound for destinations that existed only in nightmares. She had escaped through a back alley, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, her world reduced to the single imperative of survival. Your support means the world to us. Hit the subscribe button and join our community of romance lovers. The priest had asked no questions. He simply opened the heavy wooden doors of San Michele and led her to a small alcove behind the sacristy, where centuries of devoted hands had worn smooth grooves in the stone walls. "You are Isabella Benedetti now," he had whispered, pressing a worn rosary into her palms. "You are my distant niece from Napoli, come to help with the church duties. Can you remember this?" Elena had nodded, though the lie sat heavy on her tongue like communion wine. She had been raised in a house where Friday nights meant candles and ancient Hebrew prayers, where her mother's voice rose and fell in melodies that stretched back thousands of years. Now she would learn to cross herself and recite the Ave Maria, to become someone else entirely in order to simply continue breathing. The boy appeared on a Tuesday morning when the October air carried the acrid smell of smoke from the railway yards. Elena was sweeping the nave, her movements careful and silent, when she heard footsteps on the stone floor. She looked up to see a young man, perhaps 21 or 22, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of chestnuts in autumn. He carried a canvas bag slung over his shoulder and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in sacred spaces. "Isabella." His voice was soft, with the musical cadence of Roman Italian. "Father Giuseppe sent me." "I'm Marco Benedetti." Elena's heart skipped. She had heard the priest mention his nephew, the one who worked at the Vatican Secretariat, who brought news and supplies when he could slip away from his duties. She had not expected someone so young, someone whose presence seemed to fill the vast emptiness of the church with warmth. "I brought some things," Marco continued, setting his bag on a wooden pew. From within he produced a small loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in a checkered cloth. There was also a wedge of cheese, a few apples, and most precious of all, a small jar of honey that caught the filtered light streaming through the stained glass windows. Elena approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the worn stones. She had grown thin in the week since arriving at San Michele, sustained by little more than communion wafers and the occasional bowl of thin soup. The sight of real food made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space. "You're very kind." Marco studied her face with those gentle eyes, and Elena felt exposed, as if he could see through the careful construction of Isabella Benedetti to the frightened Jewish girl beneath. But instead of suspicion, she saw only compassion. "My uncle says you've had a difficult journey from the south," he said carefully. "Rome is not an easy place to be right now, especially for someone far from home." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The story they had constructed was simple. Isabella was the daughter of Father Giuseppe's deceased sister, fleeing north after her village was bombed. It was plausible enough, in a world where displacement and loss had become as common as morning prayers. Over the following weeks, Marco became a regular visitor to San Michele. He would arrive at different times, following no pattern that might attract attention, always carrying his canvas bag with its precious cargo of food and news from the outside world. Elena learned to listen for his footsteps, to distinguish them from the heavy boots of German patrols or the shuffling gait of elderly parishioners coming for confession. She began to live for these visits, though she told herself it was merely gratitude for the sustenance he provided. Marco would sit with her in the small alcove behind the sacristy, sharing not just bread and cheese, but stories of life beyond the church walls. He spoke of his work at the Vatican, carefully translating diplomatic correspondence, of the refugees who arrived each day seeking sanctuary, of the resistance networks that operated in the shadows of occupied Rome. "There are tunnels," he told her one grey November afternoon as rain drummed against the stained glass windows. "Ancient catacombs that run beneath the city. Some of our people use them to move supplies to help families escape. The Romans built well. Their secrets are still protecting us 2,000 years later." Elena watched his hands as he spoke, noting the ink stains on his fingers, the careful way he broke bread before sharing it with her. There was something almost ceremonial about these moments, as if they were creating their own private liturgy of survival and hope. "Are you part of it?" she asked quietly. "The resistance?" Marco's eyes met hers, and in them she saw depths she was only beginning to fathom. "We all resist in our own ways, Isabella. Some fight with guns, others with forged papers. I fight with words, with translation, with carrying food to those who hunger. Sometimes the smallest acts are the most dangerous." As winter settled over Rome like a heavy blanket, Elena found herself changing in ways that had nothing to do with her assumed identity. The fear that had consumed her in those first desperate weeks began to transform into something more complex. She still startled at unexpected sounds, still felt her heart race when German voices echoed in the streets beyond the church walls, but Marco's presence had created a small island of peace in the storm of her existence. She began to help him more actively in his clandestine work. Her small size and innocent appearance made her an ideal messenger, able to slip through the city's narrow alleys with notes tucked into her shoe or sewn into the hem of her worn dress. Father Giuseppe had provided her with papers identifying her as Isabella Benedetti, and she learned to inhabit this persona so completely that she sometimes forgot, for brief moments, the girl she had been before. The work was dangerous, but it gave her purpose beyond mere survival. She carried messages between safe houses, delivered ration cards to families in hiding, and once memorably helped guide a family of 5 through the tunnels Marco had described, emerging in the basement of a sympathetic baker's shop near the Pantheon. It was during one of these missions, in the bitter cold of January 1944, that Elena realized she had fallen in love. She was returning to San Michele, after delivering medicine to a pregnant woman hiding in the Jewish quarter, when she saw Marco waiting in the shadows near the church entrance. His breath made small clouds in the frigid air, and his shoulders were hunched against the cold. When he saw her approaching, his entire face transformed with relief. "Thank God," he breathed, reaching for her hands. "You were gone so long, I was afraid something had happened." The warmth of his touch sent electricity up her arms, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto a sunlit room she hadn't known existed. She looked up into his worried eyes and understood, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that this was love. Not the romantic fantasy she had dreamed of as a girl, but something deeper and more essential, forged in the crucible of shared danger and sustained hope. "I'm safe," she whispered, and realized the word meant something different now than it had before. Safety was no longer just about avoiding capture or death. Safety was this moment, this connection, the knowledge that someone in the world cared whether she came home. Marco seemed to sense the change in her as well. His grip on her hands tightened, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the darkness, 2 young people who had found something precious in the midst of unimaginable horror. "Isabella," he began, then stopped, shaking his head. "No, that's not right, is it? That's not really your name." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been so careful, so vigilant about maintaining her false identity. But Marco's gentle insistence undid her. She found herself nodding, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Elena," she whispered. "Elena Rossi." Marco's expression didn't change, except for a deepening of the tenderness in his eyes. "Elena," he repeated, as if testing the weight of her real name on his tongue. "It suits you better. It means light, doesn't it?" She nodded again, unable to speak. "Then that's what you are to me," he said simply. Light in the darkness. They were married by Father Giuseppe on a snowy morning in February, with only the priest himself as witness. It was not the wedding Elena had dreamed of as a girl. There was no flowing gown, no flowers, no celebration with family and friends. Instead, she wore her best dress, the blue wool one that Marco had brought her from his cousin's shop, and carried a small bouquet of winter herbs from the church garden. Marco wore his one good suit, the one he reserved for important occasions at the Vatican, and his hands trembled slightly as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. The ceremony was conducted in whispered Latin, their vows spoken so softly that they seemed to blend with the sighs of wind through the ancient rafters. When Father Giuseppe pronounced them husband and wife, Marco kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget, for one perfect moment, that there was a war raging beyond the sanctuary walls. But the war had not forgotten them. The Allied bombing of Rome intensified as spring arrived, and the church became a genuine shelter rather than just a hiding place. Families crowded into the nave during air raids, children crying in their mothers' arms as the building shook with each explosion. Elena and Marco worked tirelessly to comfort the frightened, to distribute what little food and water they could find, to maintain hope when hope seemed as fragile as morning frost. It was during one of these raids, in May of 1944, that their world nearly ended. Elena was in the basement with a group of children singing softly to keep them calm when she heard boots on the stone steps above. Not the familiar footfalls of parishioners or even Italian soldiers, but the harsh, measured cadence of German troops. Her blood turned to ice as voices echoed down from the nave, guttural German commands mixed with Father Giuseppe's careful, placating responses. The children sensed her fear and pressed closer, their small bodies warm against her legs. Elena forced herself to continue singing, though her voice wavered with terror. Above them she could hear furniture being moved, heavy objects overturned. They were searching the church, looking for something or someone. Minutes passed like hours. Elena's throat grew dry, but she kept singing, kept the children calm, even as her own heart threatened to burst from her chest. Finally, blessedly, the sounds faded. The boots retreated, the voices grew distant, and eventually there was only silence. When Father Giuseppe finally appeared at the basement entrance, his face was pale but relieved. "They're gone," he whispered, "but it's not safe anymore. You need to leave Rome, both of you." Elena found Marco in the sacristy, carefully burning a stack of papers in a metal basin. His face was grim, his movements quick and efficient. When he saw her, he crossed the space in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "They had a list," he said quietly against her hair. "Names of people they suspect of resistance activities. Mine was on it, yours wasn't, but they know about Isabella Benedetti now. They'll be watching." Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. After months of carefully constructed safety, the walls were crumbling around them. "Where can we go?" "North," Marco said. "I have contacts in Switzerland. It won't be easy. The passes are still dangerous, and there are patrols. But it's our best chance." They left Rome before dawn on a grey morning in late May, travelling with false papers that identified them as Marco and Isabella Conti, a young married couple from Naples seeking work in the northern factories. Elena carried only a small satchel containing her few possessions, the blue dress Marco had given her, her grandmother's locket, and the worn rosary Father Giuseppe had pressed into her hands on that first terrifying night. The journey north was a nightmare of close calls and sleepless nights. They travelled mostly by foot, avoiding main roads and railway stations where German checkpoints were common. Marco had memorized a network of safe houses and sympathetic contacts, but even with help, they were often forced to sleep in barns, abandoned buildings, or simply in the shelter of roadside ditches. Elena discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The frightened girl who had hidden behind altars had been transformed by love and necessity into someone who could walk 20 kilometers in a day, who could charm information from suspicious farmers, who could remain calm and convincing when faced with German soldiers demanding to see their papers. The worst moment came at a checkpoint near Florence, where a young SS officer studied their documents with suspicious intensity. Elena felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air, and beside her, Marco's breathing grew shallow and controlled. "You're traveling north for work?" the officer asked in accented Italian. "Yes, sir," Marco replied steadily. "My wife's cousin has found positions for us in a textile factory near Milano." The officer's pale eyes shifted to Elena. "You don't look like a factory girl." Elena forced herself to smile, channeling every lesson she had learned about becoming Isabella Benedetti. "I'm stronger than I look, sir. And we need the work." For an eternity, the officer continued to stare at her. Elena could feel her false identity balanced on a knife's edge, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Then, unexpectedly, the young man's expression softened slightly. "My sister works in a textile factory," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then, louder, "Pass through. And be careful on the mountain roads." They reached the Swiss border on a moonless night in June, guided by a grizzled partisan who knew every stone and tree in the treacherous passes. The crossing itself was a terror of whispered instructions, and hearts pounding so loudly they seemed to echo off the mountain walls. Elena and Marco crawled on their bellies through alpine meadows, their progress measured in yards rather than miles, every shadow potentially concealing a German patrol. When they finally crossed into Swiss territory, Elena collapsed into Marco's arms and wept, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that they had survived. They were alive, they were together, and for the first time in years, they were truly safe. The refugee camp near Bern was a collection of prefabricated buildings and tents that housed hundreds of displaced persons from across occupied Europe. It was crowded, often uncomfortable, and filled with the constant uncertainty of people whose futures remained unwritten. But for Elena and Marco, it was paradise. They were assigned a small room in a building housing married couples, barely large enough for a bed and a tiny table, but it was theirs. For the first time since their wedding in the shadowy nave of San Michele, they could be husband and wife without fear, without the constant need to listen for approaching footsteps or to have escape routes planned in their minds. Elena found work in the camp's makeshift school, teaching Italian to other refugees and helping with the youngest children. Marco was assigned to the administrative office, where his language skills and careful handwriting made him invaluable in processing the endless stream of paperwork that documented human displacement on an industrial scale. In the evenings, they would walk together around the camp's perimeter, talking about their hopes for the future. Marco dreamed of returning to his translation work, perhaps finding a position with an international organization dedicated to rebuilding the shattered world. Elena spoke tentatively of her desire to teach, to work with children who had experienced trauma similar to their own. But mostly, they simply treasured the miracle of ordinary moments, sharing meals without fear, sleeping through the night without starting at every sound, planning for tomorrow with the reasonable expectation that tomorrow would actually come. The war ended while they were still in Switzerland, the news arriving in a flood of radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines that seemed almost too momentous to believe. Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, and across Europe, the machinery of genocide had finally ground to a halt. For Elena, the end of the war brought a complicated mixture of joy and profound grief. She and Marco celebrated with their fellow refugees, sharing precious bottles of wine and dancing to an accordion played by a Polish violinist who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during his escape from occupied Warsaw. But in quieter moments, Elena found herself confronting the magnitude of her losses. Her parents and brother were gone. She had known this in her heart for months, but the official confirmation came through Red Cross channels in the autumn of 1945. The apartment where she had grown up had been converted into offices for Nazi administrators. The synagogue where her family had worshipped for generations had been destroyed, its ancient stones scattered to build fortifications that ultimately proved useless against the advancing Allied armies. Elena mourned these losses, but she also recognized that she carried something precious forward: memory, love, and the unbreakable human capacity to create new life from the ashes of the old. She and Marco began to speak seriously about making permanent plans, about choosing a country where they could build a future together. The decision, when it came, was simpler than Elena had expected. Marco received a job offer from the newly formed United Nations, a position in New York that would use his linguistic skills in service of international diplomacy. Elena looked at the letter of appointment, then at her husband's hopeful face, and knew their path forward. America, she said, testing the word on her tongue. It sounds like a place where we could disappear in the best possible way. They arrived in New York Harbor on a grey morning in March 1946, standing at the rail of a converted troop transport ship as the Statue of Liberty emerged from the morning mist. Elena clutched Marco's hand and thought of all the miles they had traveled, all the identities they had assumed and discarded, all the nights they had fallen asleep, wondering if they would wake up alive. "What do you think?" Marco asked, his voice barely audible over the ship's engines and the excited chatter of their fellow passengers. Elena considered the question seriously, studying the massive city that spread before them like a promise made in steel and stone. She thought of the girl she had been, hiding behind altars and learning to cross herself with hands that had once lit Sabbath candles. She thought of the woman she had become, who had learned that love could flourish even in the darkness, that hope could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. "I think," she said finally, "that we're going to be happy here." And they were. Marco found fulfillment in his work at the United Nations, translating not just languages, but cultural nuances that helped nations begin the slow work of understanding each other. Elena earned her teaching certificate from Columbia University and spent 40 years working with immigrant children in the public schools of Queens, helping them navigate the complex process of becoming American while honoring the cultures they had left behind. They never forgot the darkness they had survived, but they refused to let it define them. Instead, they built a life characterized by small acts of kindness, by opening their home to other refugees, by raising 3 children who grew up knowing that they were the living proof of love's triumph over hatred. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1964, Marco surprised Elena with a trip back to Rome. The city had been rebuilt, modernized, its war scars healed with new construction and fresh paint. But San Michele still stood, ancient and enduring, its stones worn smooth by centuries of faithful hands. Father Giuseppe was gone. He had died peacefully in 1958. But his successor, a young priest named Father Antonio, welcomed them warmly and showed them the small plaque that had been installed near the altar. "In memory of those who found sanctuary here during the dark years, 1943-1944. Elena and Marco stood hand in hand before the altar where they had been married, where they had learned that love could survive anything if it was fed with hope and protected with courage. The church was no longer a hiding place, but a testament to the power of sanctuary, to the human capacity to create sacred spaces even in the midst of unspeakable horror. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked as they walked through the narrow streets of Trastevere, past cafes and shops that sparkled with prosperity and normalcy. "All the running, all the fear, all the years we lost?" Marco stopped walking and turned to face her. His hair now touched with silver, but his eyes still the same warm chestnut brown that had first made her feel safe. "Lost years," he said, raising her hand to his lips. "My love, we didn't lose anything. We found each other. And everything else, America, our children, our life together, all of it grew from those moments when you were just a frightened girl hiding behind an altar, and I was just a boy trying to bring you food and hope." Elena smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest like sunlight. They had been through fire and emerged not unscathed, but transformed. They had learned that love was not just an emotion, but an act of resistance, a daily choice to create beauty and meaning in a world that often seemed determined to destroy both. That evening, as they sat in a small restaurant near the Pantheon, sharing wine and watching Romans go about their ordinary lives, Elena raised her glass to her husband of 20 years. "To sanctuary," she said softly. "To sanctuary," Marco agreed, touching his glass to hers. "And to the boy who brought food to a hidden girl, never knowing he was actually bringing her home." Outside, Rome continued its ancient rhythm, a city that had survived countless wars and would survive countless more. But inside the restaurant, 2 people who had found each other in the darkness celebrated the simple miracle of being alive, being together, being home at last. The candles on their table flickered in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows on their faces, shadows that no longer held any terror, but only the gentle play of light and darkness that makes all beautiful things more precious by contrast. They had learned in the crucible of history's worst chapter that love was not fragile at all, but the strongest force in the human experience, capable of creating light in the deepest darkness and building homes in the most unlikely places. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything.